Welcome back to another beautiful day in the land of music. My name is Douglas, and in today's video, I'm going to talk through using virtual instruments versus a physical keyboard in a church or live worship setting. And so this is a question I get a lot. Is it better to use virtual instruments, a program like MainStage and a controller, or is it better to use a physical keyboard or a digital piano when I'm up on stage playing for church? And I think this comes down to a few different points that I want to highlight. And I will say that I've used both over the past years. My church currently uses virtual instruments inside MainStage for the synth section of our worship team. And when I'm playing, I bring the Nord Stage 3, but they also have a Korg SV-1. So if there's a synth player and a piano player, they'll end up splitting them. The synth player uses MainStage with a controller. The piano player uses the Korg SV-1. If I'm there, I'm either doing everything on the Nord Stage 3 or I'm playing piano on the Nord Stage 3 and we have someone playing synth on the MainStage controller rig. So I have experience with both, and I think there are pros and cons to both that I want to highlight here. So the first thing to think about is the experience level of the players on your team. If your keyboard or synth player is just starting out, they're just trying to get the hang of things and get the hang of playing, it may be easier to use a physical keyboard with just some basic sounds that they can really get the hang of playing those synth sounds. If they're a little bit more experienced or they've got some technical knowledge on the computer, you could go with MainStage, which is pretty easy to use, but it does take a little bit of setup to program with whichever controller you're using it with, as well as to program the different sounds you want. You can go buy sound packs, and those are great, except you still have to do kind of the setup and figure out what works for the songs you do at your church. So there's pros and cons, and it really is going to depend on the experience level of the players, the synth and the piano players at your church, to be able to decide, okay, do they have the technical aptitude to be able to use a program like MainStage? And if they've got a lot of ability, then you could introduce Ableton Live, and that's going to be a little bit more complicated than MainStage. So just keep that in mind. If you're dealing with players that don't have much technical knowledge on a computer, it might be hard to get them to use a virtual instrument controller setup because there's a little bit more they're going to have to learn than just picking a sound and playing it on a physical keyboard. So the other thing to think about too is reliability. So virtual instrument, controller, when you think about the number of components that make up that sort of a rig, you're going to have the laptop. And if you're using MainStage, it needs to be a Mac. If you're using Ableton Live, you could do Mac or Windows. And I've even run a Pro Tools session, just a simple Pro Tools session with multiple instrument tracks with different virtual instruments on them. And then I just solo the one that I want to play at that time. I did use that this summer at a live gig because we needed some instruments that weren't really the best suited for the Nord Stage 3. So I wanted to have a second keyboard setup or a controller setup with my virtual instruments from Complete Ultimate 13. I pulled a couple instruments in from there and I played those with the controller and just soloed the track. For me, I'm used to doing that in my studio, so it was really simple for me to just solo the tracks that I wanted to play at that time. In the case of church, most likely your players aren't going to have studio recording experience or experience with some of the more popular DAWs. They're really going to be focused on just trying to play with your worship team. So when you think about the components, you have the laptop, you have the software within the laptop, you have the controller that you're playing with connected to the laptop, and then you need to get the sound from the laptop to the front of the house, and that's done usually with an audio interface. So I have a Focusrite Scarlett interface. At church, we use a different audio interface, but we still have an audio interface to take the audio from the virtual instruments and transfer that into the snake that goes to front of house so they can mix it with the other sounds and the other instruments on your worship team. So when you think of the components, that's the laptop, the controller, the software, the audio interface. Every time you introduce a component, you have introduced risk of failure. And we've dealt with this a little bit at my own church, is that our audio interface, something in the connection has been failing. So sometimes it's fine, it plays fine, and then other times it loses connection, and this could happen mid-song. And thankfully with synth, it's not as big of a deal because there's other instruments there carrying the song. But if you were playing a main piano part on a controller and either the audio interface cut out or the controller cut out, or your computer froze up and the software froze up, you have all of those potential issues to deal with. So coming back to the experience of your players, that's less of an issue if your players know how to reset the software or unplug, replug, and try to fix a connection. But all of that can add stress to a live situation. So when you think about the flip side is a physical keyboard is you really have one component, and that is the workstation, the digital piano, a keyboard like the MainStage 3, where you have just one component that goes left, right, out to the sound system, and that's it. There's no additional components in there. And so for me, I've been playing for over 20 years, and maybe 3 times in those 20 years, I've had a physical keyboard fail on me. And it was really only with the Korg SV-1. I had a problem where it would freeze up every once in a while. Could have been a voltage issue with the electricity I was plugged into, but 3 times, and it wasn't during main piano parts, so it actually was okay. Just turn it off and back on again. But besides those 3 times, I've never had a physical keyboard fail me when I've been playing it, either in the studio or live. And the other thing to think about there is all of these keyboards that you're playing, whether it's a Yamaha, Roland, Korg, Nord, all of these have been most likely out for years. They've been played by hundreds, if not thousands of different artists. They've been tested thoroughly. And so the reliability of the rig itself is very good compared to a virtual instrument controller rig where you've got software that's been tested, controller that's been tested, computer, and all of those things. You know, they may have been tested with certain controllers, but then you may get a controller that wasn't tested with the software and has a bug. So those are things to think about, not trying to discourage you from going the virtual instrument route, but you do introduce a little bit more risk from a reliability perspective, in my experience, with a virtual instrument controller rig versus a physical keyboard. So the third thing to think about is features and flexibility. So with virtual instruments, you have basically an unlimited number of sounds and options when it comes to programs and being able to buy new ones. There's really hundreds of thousands of samples and sounds out there. So if you're looking for something specific, most likely you can find it. With keyboards and physical digital pianos, workstations, you're a little bit more limited to the sounds that come with it. When you have a keyboard like the MainStage 3, you can download or import presets or sounds into the Nord, but you're still a little bit limited. Takes some work to do that. And so out of the gate, you're potentially a little bit more restricted, though I've found that no matter what I'm playing, as long as I have a solid piano sound, electric piano, organ, I really don't feel like I'm limited too much. It's really only when it gets to string and synth sounds where you start to kind of see the difference between some of the digital pianos and keyboards out there. There's a lot of amazing pad sounds on virtual instruments now, and you'll hear those a lot in Hillsong music and things like that, where that's a little bit more difficult to replicate inside a keyboard unless I have a dedicated preset for it. So the other thing is flexibility. So in a virtual instrument, you can tweak everything, but you need to use the computer mouse or assign the parameters to the controller you're using. That's assuming you have a controller with knobs and faders and the ability to control the software. Whereas with like the MainStage 3, everything is tweakable right here on the front. If I want to add a little reverb, I can add a little reverb on the fly very quickly without reaching for a mouse, without worrying about, did I program this knob to that parameter? And so when you're used to using a keyboard, whether it's a workstation, a digital piano, or the MainStage 3, I would say the MainStage 3 offers an immense amount of possibility for live tweaking. You may not get that in some of the lower end keyboards, but you still will get some ability to tweak things on the fly. And so with the MainStage 3, I can change the frequency of my pad. I can change the volume of my layers very quickly, really without much thought as I'm playing. So there's some benefit to having that flexibility of being able to tweak the sounds without needing to go in and tweak them on the computer. So keep that in mind as you're trying to make that decision. And then I would say the last point to make here is price. So if you're gonna go with something like MainStage and a controller, you can get this done fairly cheaply if you have a computer already. So in the case of our church, they had to go out and purchase a Mac. So now you're already up to $1,500 to $2,000 for the Mac, MainStage, the controller, the audio interface, the cables that go in between, the stand for the controller. So they were probably at a good $2,000. So if you think, what can you get for a keyboard or a workstation for $2,000? You're somewhere in the ballpark of maybe a Korg SV-2, some of the Roland digital pianos. Simpler digital pianos will be less than that. Workstations, the Nord Stage 3, are going to be more expensive, between the 25 to 35 range. If you want the 88 key Nord Stage 3, you're going to be looking at over 4,000 US dollars. So price range on keyboards ranges drastically depending on the features and the sounds that you want. I would recommend trying to hit somewhere in the middle if you're just getting started, not going with something really cheap. You don't need a Nord Stage 3, though if you can afford it, it does give you a lot of great live ability. But with a virtual instrument, depending on whether you have a computer or not, so if you already have a Mac that you can use, MainStage is pretty cheap, a controller is pretty cheap, so your overall cost to get set up isn't going to be that much. If you go Ableton Live, that's going to cost you a bit more than MainStage, but all of these different components cost different amounts. So depending on what you already have, you may be able to get into it for cheaper than going out and getting a digital piano. So when it comes to cost, it really is down to your unique situation, and it could come out to be a benefit on the virtual instrument controller side, but you may also end up spending what you would on a fairly nice featured digital piano like the Korg SV-2. So weigh that in as you're trying to decide what's better for your church. And I would say the final point here is just from an overall perspective is what is going to allow you as a worship team and as a synth piano keyboard player to be able to contribute the best to your team. And so if you're trying to use something that's way too complicated and that isn't a good fit for you as a keyboard player, you're not going to be able to contribute as much to the worship team as if you're playing something that maybe is a bit simpler. You can just pick sounds, play those sounds, and you're good to go. So depending on, again, coming back to that experience, plays heavily into how much you're contributing to your team and how much stress and frustration is there for the members on your worship team. So worship teams vary greatly in their experience level, both from individual players playing as a team. And so you really have to factor that in as for your church specifically, what's going to work best for you. So I want to hear from you, questions that you have, put those in the comments below around maybe your unique situation. I've been playing for 20 years. I've been playing live for maybe 10 to 15 years. I've played in a lot of different churches. I've played live, toured with a band. And so I have a lot of different experience with different keyboards, different controller, virtual instrument setups. So I want to hear from you. If you've got specific questions around your scenario, ask those. I'll do my best to answer those. And then if you have any thoughts around this, if you think definitely virtual instrument controller is the way to go, I'd love to hear that from you. Or if you're on the other side of the fence and you think a keyboard or even a mix, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts? What are your comments on this topic of which one is better, especially in 2021 as software gets to be a little bit better, more reliable, as controllers get more fully featured. So I want to hear from you. What do you think is better, virtual instruments and a controller or a physical keyboard like the Nord Stage 3. So I hope this video was helpful for you if you're trying to figure out which option is best for your scenario. Again, if you've got questions, throw those down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, stay inspired, and keep making that music.